So we've looked at the two extreme market structures: perfect competition with a ton of firms, no product differentiation, low barriers to entry, and pure monopoly with one firm, no close substitutes for the product, and high barriers to entry. And then we looked at a hybrid of the two: monopolistic competition, which of course has many firms, differentiated products, and low barriers to entry. So now we look at the fourth market structure that economists identify as the fourth sort of center of gravity around which most real-world markets uh, will resemble in some way or another, and that is oligopoly. And oligopoly is, well, for me, it's one of the most interesting of the market structures. It's a little more complex, and for that reason, I think a lot of economists hate to study oligopolies. I think it's rich with ways of looking at it. It's not one of the two extremes unless it is. And it's definitely not a hybrid of the two extremes. So what am I saying? Well, it can essentially be exactly the same as monopoly, or it could be the same as perfect competition. It's never really the same as monopolistic competition, though. So that still doesn't necessarily make sense. To help us understand how to look at oligopoly and how to know what I just said, let's do the same thing we did with the other three market structures, where we look at those three defining features and then we'll look at the assumptions. So the characteristics. Perfect competition had many firms, as did monopolistic competition. Pure monopoly had only one. Oligopoly has few producers. Now again, we're not concerned about the number. Just like with many firms, it doesn't really matter what the number is, if it's 20 firms, 100, a million. Many basically means there are too many firms for any one firm to be able to influence the rest of the firms. If any one firm decides to do things a little differently, then it's not in a perfectly competitive market anymore. It'll either drop out because they won't be able to get any business, or they'll become a monopolist or a monopolistic competitor or something like that. They're not necessarily going to influence the other firms, though. Since all products are the same, you're really just going to fiddle with the price, which means you're either not going to cover your costs, or you're going to get everyone coming to you, or you're going to not get anyone coming to you. So you can't really affect any other firm. No one firm is going to change things. That's the point of many firms. Few producers, few firms is saying that now, and we're going to see this in the assumptions, one firm can change everything for everybody else. Now, again, when we're talking about one firm changing for everybody else, or a few firms, just like with pure monopoly, there's only one firm. In practice, we'll often say one dominant firm, because in practice, monopolies have been defined as controlling, say, 80% of the market for just one firm, and then there are a bunch of other smaller firms dividing up the other 20 who don't really impact that one dominant firm. For oligopolists, when we say few firms, again, there could be a whole bunch of firms, but they're really small and they don't really impact things. There are a few firms who do. So we don't really get into dominant firms in this class. At the intermediate level, you start to look at how one firm can be dominant, but even the firms that aren't dominant, they can still affect things. They can still affect the dominant firm at least a little bit, though not as much as the dominant firm can affect the rest of them. So they're large enough to be important even if they're not dominant. So oligopoly means few producers who can change things on their own unilaterally, versus just one or a whole bunch, none of whom can change anything. So few important firms, few dominant firms. But the point here is it's a small enough number to where you have to know what your competitors are doing at all times. You can't just take the market price and you're done. You have to go a little bit further beyond that. And as far as the product is concerned, we had one standardized product in perfect competition. We had one product with no close substitutes with monopolists, and then we had differentiated products with monopolistic competition. With oligopoly, the way I and a lot of other economists cover it, we just go back to one standardized product to introduce it, because it simplifies things, but there are contexts in which you might say standardized or differentiated, it doesn't matter. They're as long as they're close together. We look at Pepsi and Coke as oligopolists. They're two dominant firms in the industry. Their products are not standardized. They are differentiated slightly. So there are consumer preferences, but the consumer preferences aren't strong enough to where anybody's going to pay a massive amount more for their favorite brand. It's that a lot of market research has been done, and they are actually such close substitutes that just a couple cents difference in price can have huge differences in buying behavior. But you can still model them as oligopolists with similar but differentiated products. But to simplify things, to introduce it, we're basically saying that the oligopolists are a few firms who are producing the same thing. You can get the exact same thing by going to the competitor. Doesn't really change the results too much. So remember, if you can make a simplification that doesn't change the results, make the simplification so that analyzing the market is easier. And then finally, barriers to entry. That's the third thing we look at. And if you haven't already noticed, I think I may have pointed it out, but if I hadn't, you may have noticed if there are a lot of firms, there are low barriers to entry. So perfect competition and monopolistic competition both have low barriers to entry in many firms. If there aren't many firms, there are high barriers to entry. Monopolists have one firm and high barriers to entry. So you can guess already that oligopolies will rise if there are high barriers to entry. There are few producers, which when we get to the assumptions, one of them is going to be that you can have positive profits. With perfect competition, monopolistic competition, remember, in the long run, you're not going to have positive economic profits. You're going to have normal profit or zero economic profit because ease of entry and exit into the market is going to result in a lot of firm entry into a market where people are making money, which is going to drive prices down and eliminate profits. With monopolies, you have one firm that can earn long-run economic profits. If other firms, why not get in on the action yourself if you can easily enter into the market? The answer is do enter into the market. So you have to have high barriers to entry, like economies of scale, patent law, the things we went over. So with oligopoly, we're right back to high barriers to entry, and they're generally the same barriers that would exist with monopoly, whether you have patent laws, and maybe you can make something similar, or you can have some sort of sharing of patent laws. You can have a few firms who've managed to achieve economies of scale large enough to be able to match each other with lower prices. You can have geographical elements where a couple stores open up in a remote area and they're competing with each other for the same group of customers. Again, a lot of the same things that would cause high barriers to entry for monopolists would exist for oligopolists. But you have to have high barriers to entry if you're going to have few producers. So, the assumptions. We are back to firms being price makers. You're not a price taker. And really, that's only perfect competition where you're a price taker. In the rest of these market models, you have some pricing flexibility. But this comes with... It's a little bit harder with oligopoly. With monopolistic competition, for example, since differentiated products are not perfect substitutes, you can look at your competitors, and if you know that your customers tend to prefer your product, you might be able to charge a little bit more, but you can't get away with hiking the price by too much. With monopolies, you just find the highest willingness to pay at your optimal quantity and charge that. So you have different degrees of flexibility in price making, but they're all pretty set by market conditions. With oligopolists, you can set your price, but you have to be careful. You might actually have to take a lowest market price possible, a price equals marginal cost, perfect competition thing, but you would like to charge more, but you have to be careful about that. And again, we'll get into that, but you are technically a price maker if you're an oligopolist. As usual, as with all of them, the market's clear, but here we're saying at the lowest chosen price. This leads into the price maker thing. The market price that prevails, if you chose a higher price than your competitors, markets won't clear for you. You will not sell all of your output. Remember, that's what market clearing means. It means whatever output you produced, you sell it as long as you charge the optimal price. In oligopoly, you might be able to charge a price that's higher than marginal cost and sell everything, but it depends on what other firms are doing. So whichever lowest chosen price prevails in the market, whichever firm has the lowest price, they'll sell everything they produced, while other firms might be left without having sold anything. So it's markets clear, but with a catch here. And again, we'll get into how the pricing decision is made. We also looked at the perceived demand curve for the other markets. Remember, it was perfectly flat for perfect competition. It was the market demand curve for monopolists, and monopolistic competition was exactly in between. Here, again, it depends on the firm, the apostrophes after the S here, so it's every firm's output and pricing decision. There's a lot of mystery here with the assumptions, but it's not necessarily the market demand curve, although it kind of could be. And then finally, we say that firms are mutually, not finally, there's one more, but firms are mutually interdependent. And this is the key to having few firms. Few firms mean that they're interdependent. It means that you have to at least be able to guess correctly at what the other firm is doing to determine what you're doing. And then positive economic profits are possible in the long run. Now, with monopolists, we said they're not inevitable because market demand may just not be where it needs to be for any production level to exceed average total cost, allowing for that. Remember, that's the key. If price is above average total cost, then you can make positive economic profits. Monopolist competition, perfect competition, it's not possible in the long run. In monopoly, it's possible, but not always going to be there. Here with oligopoly, positive economic profits may still not prevail even if demand levels are high enough so that prices can exceed average total cost. However, under certain narrow circumstances, it is possible to maintain positive economic profits in the long run. So it seems with all of these, I'm alluding to things I'm not explaining because the rest of this section explains them. But first, you may have heard of cartels. We often associate this with drug cartels, but in more legal markets, we've heard of oil cartels, OPEC, basically a few dominant firms who can work together to keep output levels and pricing at levels that allow them to make more money than they would if they weren't able to collude. But a cartel is essentially a formalized collusive agreement, which is generally illegal. So if you're going to form something that looks like a cartel, which you're basically, look at this is monopoly, right? You should recognize the monopoly situation where you have positive economic profits. That's why if you have few firms and high barriers to entry, the firms would absolutely want to work together to get lower quantities and higher prices and enjoy positive economic profits. And that is what a cartel is. It's when there's a formal collusive agreement. If there is no formal collusive agreement, there isn't a cartel, but there may be something called tacit collusion. And we'll get to that, but this is just defining cartels right now. So how do firms decide on their pricing and their quantity decisions? Well, we said that you have to know what everybody else is doing. So we introduce game theory. And I'm introducing it at the end of the video here. We're going to get into it in more earnest in the next videos. But game theory basically means you're taking everybody else's decisions into account. And you have to know what other people are doing. And you're making strategic choices. You have to know what the other firms are doing. You know that they know that you know what they're doing. And you make your decision that way. So be sure to watch the other videos I uploaded to D2L as we get into the next set of videos on this, because I will refer to them often.